Welcome to a summary on a naive conversation in philosophy. We spend a lot of time discussing these concepts in our podcast, so if you want to look at it more in depth, you can look at that, but we'll just be going over a quick recap. What is consciousness? We discussed consciousness and how it can be measured. But consciousness can be measured in two ways we discussed. It can either be binary, where something is conscious or not conscious, or it could be a scale, like how it's shown in panpsychism, where everything has an innate consciousness built into it. And we did discuss how consciousness is more likely to be something that's a scale, because it is kind of arbitrary to set something as consciousness or not consciousness binarily. And also, we did talk about if it is a scale, we do have to address if there is a lower limit to that scale. For example, something that is biological, like RNA, for example, the most biologically simple macromolecule that's capable of quote unquote conscious thought. And we also talked about how if it could be replicated in AI.
Yeah, we also try to apply the consciousness scale to AI, and we defined our consciousness scale as like an input of stimuli and information and desires, both of which AI is lacking in the moment.
We also discussed if consciousness is scientific or not, which the question of it being scientific, at the current moment, we don't have an exact definition of consciousness that we can declare as scientific, but most of us agreed that future advances in technology will allow us to explore consciousness in a more scientific and empirical manner. In the discussion of free will, we talked about how the existence of quantum fluctuations can cause us to deter from a deterministic path that is perhaps algorithmic in nature. And we did relate how human behavior in AI works, where perhaps our mind is implicitly solving optimization problems to optimize for a value that is arbitrary, for example, happiness or utilitarianism. And we did mention Roger Penrose's research and how quantum fluctuations in the microtubules of our neurons can actually cause us to exhibit free will behavior in some kind of way.
Also, due to my religious background, I brought up how hard it is also for religion to reconcile free will due to God's omniscience and his gifting us a free will.
So in this discussion, we talked about how consciousness influences reality, and we did mention the double slit experiment where we had wave functions being reduced into particles because we're observing it. And this kind of relates to how illusions work, where our mind fundamentally alters reality so it's comprehensible by mankind. And
I also mentioned how history and physics are reconcilable due to for example, the ice ages and the Middle Ages, and how history and climatology both support that.
We introduced a interesting thought experiment involving aliens and how aliens may have seen the beginning of the universe, but their interpretation of the beginning of the universe may contradict our physical models. And that brings up the interesting question of what you would consider history and what you would consider physics. And this also brings up the limitations in our empirical study of science and how perhaps there are patterns or senses that we're incapable of understanding, or incapable of using to understand the universe.
One can also ask the question about whether or not consciousness can be treated in the same manner as language, in that Noam Chomsky famously theorized that language is a biological faculty that matures over time in the same way that our bodies are pre-programmed to developed via puberty. Perhaps consciousness matures in the same manner. One can also relate to the Sapir-Whorf theory, which stipulates that language dictates how we perceive the world and how we internalize our own lived experiences. Perhaps there is a certain degree of phenomenology that is relevant to studies about consciousness, questions about consciousness that ought to be elaborated on.
We also discussed how we never developed an evolutionary need to know more about the mind, kind of how similar how they never developed a need to know more about our anatomy, just because it's not a biological imperative like needing to eat or needing to drink or needing to sleep.
Perhaps there could be a question to be asked about whether superconsciousness exists, such as is the consciousness that we currently experience only a subset of what is potentially possible through further evolution or further items of development.
We talked about how meditation can be used to achieve this supposed super consciousness, but we also talked about how meditation is maybe just a method for understanding the mind.
Yeah, similar to how art is, how it helps explain stuff that's going on in the mind rather than actually reaching a different level of like a transcendent level.
Despite this, we also discussed the suspicious parallels between Buddhism and our understanding of quantum physics.